This is a story almost no one knows. For centuries, Ukraine and Russia have clashed, not just in the modern era, but across history. From Cossack uprisings to imperial wars, from revolutions to independence struggles, their conflicts shaped Eastern Europe in ways the world has nearly forgotten. This is not just one war. It is a chain of wars, rebellions, and betrayals stretching for hundreds of years. And this is the Lost Chapters. The first great clash between Ukraine and Russia can be traced back to the mid-17th century, when the Ukrainian lands were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Cossacks, fierce warriors of the steppes, sought autonomy and recognition of their rights. In 1648, Bohdan Khmelnytsky led a massive rebellion that shook the Commonwealth and created the foundation of a Ukrainian state. At first, the Hetmanate sought allies everywhere, from the Ottoman Empire to the Crimean Khanate. Finally, in 1654, the Cossacks turned to Moscow. At the Treaty of Pereyaslav, the Cossacks pledged allegiance to the Tsar, hoping to gain protection while keeping autonomy. But Moscow saw things differently. Where the Cossacks envisioned an alliance, Russia saw an opportunity for annexation. Almost immediately, tensions erupted. The Russo-Polish War, 1654 to 1667, dragged Ukraine into a brutal battlefield. The Hetmanate was split. Some leaders sided with Moscow, others with Poland. Ukraine became the pawn and prize of larger empires. The result was devastating. By the war's end, Ukraine was divided by the Dnieper River, the left bank under Moscow's control, the right bank under Poland. It was the first time Moscow gained a permanent foothold in Ukrainian lands. For Ukrainians, it was both a tragic betrayal and the beginning of centuries of struggle against Russian dominance.
By the late 17th century, Ukraine's Hetmanate still existed, but its autonomy was shrinking. Moscow imposed greater control, limiting the freedom of the Cossacks. One man, Hetman Ivan Mazepa, dreamed of restoring independence. In the early 1700s, Europe was engulfed in the Great Northern War. Mazepa saw his chance. He secretly allied with Sweden's King Charles XII, promising to bring Ukrainian Cossacks into the fight against Russia. In 1709, at the Battle of Poltava, the fate of Ukraine hung in the balance. But disaster struck. The Swedes were crushed, and Mazepa's gamble failed. Russia's Tsar Peter the Great branded him a traitor. Mazepa fled into exile, dying broken and defeated. The Cossack Hetmanate was punished harshly, its autonomy further stripped, its leaders executed or replaced by men loyal to Moscow. For Ukrainians, Mazepa became both a tragic and heroic figure, a man who dared to dream of independence but paid the ultimate price. For Russia, Poltava was the triumph that secured its empire in Eastern Europe. It was a turning point. From then on, Russia claimed Ukraine not as a partner, but as territory destined to be absorbed into the empire. After Poltava, Russia's grip on Ukraine tightened. The Hetmanate still existed in name, but Moscow dictated its politics. The Zaporizhian Siege, the independent Cossack fortress on the Dnieper, was tolerated only so long as it served Russian interests. By the 18th century, Catherine the Great sought to eliminate this independence altogether. In 1775, after Ukraine had been drawn into Russia's wars against the Ottomans, Catherine ordered the destruction of the Zaporizhian Siege. Russian troops surrounded the Cossack stronghold, dismantled its walls, and ended centuries of Cossack freedom. Many Cossacks fled, some joining Ottoman lands, others scattering across Europe. Ukraine, once the land of free warriors, was now largely absorbed into the Russian Empire. For the first time, Moscow's dream of turning Ukraine into its Little Russia seemed complete. But memories of independence lingered. Songs, poems, and folklore carried the spirit of resistance. The dream of freedom was never extinguished. It was merely buried, waiting to rise again. The 19th century was an age of nationalism across Europe. For Ukrainians, it was also the century of Russification. Russian authorities banned the Ukrainian language in schools and print, censored literature, and treated Ukrainians as part of a greater Russian people. But resistance grew in culture as well as politics. Poets like Taras Shevchenko kept the flame of Ukrainian identity alive. Secret societies spread ideas of independence. Peasants remembered the Cossacks as heroes of freedom, while intellectuals built the foundations of modern nationalism. Russia, however, responded with repression. Each sign of Ukrainian self-assertion was punished. Universities, churches, and local leaders were forced to adopt Russian language and customs. By the late 19th century, the idea of a free Ukraine seemed almost impossible. Yet beneath the surface, the seeds of resistance were germinating, seeds that would erupt with the revolutions of the 20th century.
The collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 opened a new chapter. Suddenly, the dream of independence returned. The Ukrainian People's Republic was declared, led by the Central Rada in Kyiv. For a brief moment, Ukraine was free. But chaos ruled the former empire. Russia's Bolsheviks launched invasions, determined to keep Ukraine under Moscow's control. Between 1917 and 1921, Ukraine became the battlefield of a dozen armies: Ukrainian nationalists, Bolsheviks, White Russians, Germans, Poles, anarchists under Nestor Makhno. Cities changed hands multiple times in a single year. In the end, the Bolsheviks triumphed. Ukraine was absorbed into the Soviet Union as a republic, but in reality under Moscow's total control. For Ukrainians, it was another bitter defeat. Yet, the memory of those short-lived years of independence kept the dream alive.
The Soviet period brought not peace, but oppression. In the 1930s, Stalin imposed collectivization, stripping Ukrainian peasants of land and grain. The result was the Holodomor, a man-made famine that killed millions. Russia denied it, but survivors remembered it as deliberate punishment for Ukraine's resistance to Soviet rule. During World War II, Ukraine was again a battlefield. Some Ukrainians fought in the Red Army. Others joined nationalist movements like the UPA, resisting both Nazi and Soviet forces. For Moscow, these fighters were bandits. For Ukrainians, they were patriots refusing to accept foreign domination. After the war, repression continued. Ukrainian dissidents were imprisoned, literature was censored, culture was Russified. Yet resistance lived on underground, in songs, in secret meetings, in samizdat publications. The struggle never disappeared.
In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine declared independence. For the first time in centuries, Ukrainians ruled themselves. But Russia never accepted it fully. Through politics, propaganda, and economic pressure, Moscow tried to keep Kyiv under its influence. In 2014, after Ukraine's Revolution of Dignity, Russia seized Crimea and launched war in Donbass. In 2022, it escalated into a full-scale invasion. Yet, the long history of resistance had forged a strong national identity. Ukrainians remembered Khmelnytsky, Mazepa, Shevchenko, the rebels of 1917, the victims of famine, the dissidents of the Soviet years. Each struggle had prepared them for the present fight. What began centuries ago as battles of Cossacks and Tsars now continues with tanks and missiles. But the essence is the same: Ukraine refusing to be erased.
If you've never heard this story, the centuries of wars between Ukraine and Russia, now you know one of history's greatest struggles. And there are many more forgotten chapters waiting to be told. Subscribe to The Lost Chapters and never look at history the same way again.